What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Daily Bible Reading Snapshot. Today we're looking at Jeremiah 14, 15, and 16. Then we're looking at 1 Timothy chapter 5 in the New Testament. And here in the book of Jeremiah, we see that there's some type of drought that's going on for the people. And Jeremiah does exactly what he should do. And he says, do you know why this is happening? This is happening because of your sin, Judeans. This is your sin that brought this about. God is judging you. Be careful that you don't see this discipline and treat it like it's no big deal. Be careful that you turn back to God. He says, though our iniquities testify against us, O Lord, for your name's sake, for our backslidings are many, we have sinned against you. He says, God, you are our hope. Please do something about this. Jeremiah says, I know it's our fault, but please save us. But then he says, the reality is for the people, they loved to wander, and they have not restrained their feet. Wandering, obviously, in this context, is talking about going off into sin. He says about the people, they've loved to do what is evil and wrong. And that goes back to the heart problem that we see brought up literally every day in Jeremiah. It's like, do the people have good hearts or bad hearts? Well, evil hearts. Is that true now? Was it just true back then? No, it's definitely true now too. People have evil hearts. Further, it says their evil hearts make them want to believe false prophets, people who are telling them lies. And we see here more prophets are telling people lies in chapter 14. He says they're saying the sword will never come upon this land. Famine, never. It's never going to happen to this land because we're God's people. It doesn't matter how we live. It doesn't matter how we act. God is going to take care of us. He says, well, be careful about that because there's evil everywhere in this town of Jerusalem, in this countryside of Judea. He says they are doing what's evil. And he says, Jeremiah talks to God. He says, have you utterly rejected Judah? Does your soul loathe Zion, which is Jerusalem? Why have you struck us down? And there's no healing. We acknowledge, he confesses. Jeremiah says, we acknowledge our wickedness, O Lord, and the iniquity of our fathers, for we have sinned against you. Please, God, don't spurn us for your name's sake. Don't dishonor your glorious throne. Don't do that, please. And then chapter number 15, God says, even if I had Moses and Samuel here, Jeremiah, the reality is I wouldn't stop this judgment. Just because you're here, Jeremiah, doesn't mean I'm going to stop this judgment. Even if Moses and Samuel were prophets at this time, God says, I would still destroy Jerusalem. Think about the power of that. I think Jeremiah might have felt in such a way like it was his fault. I might have felt like, well, if I was doing better, maybe I could stop this. And God says, look, even if it was Moses, even if it was Samuel, even if it was people that lived long before who might have been more righteous and holy than you are, Jeremiah, even if it was them, I wouldn't stop it. And I think that's helpful for Jeremiah because he has a terrible time. And he complains here. He says, woe is me. This is a terrible life God has given me. Why? Well, because his whole job is to tell people who think they're doing the right thing, to tell them they're sinners. You might feel that if you're engaging in some type of evangelism, you might say, wow, what a horrible job because I'm telling people they're in sin. Well, the reality is we need to see this the right way. And God is the one who's protecting. And he says, in verse 16, Jeremiah says, your words were found and I ate them and your words became to me a joy. We need to remember that sharing the truth with people is a joy. Even if it's hard sometimes, the truth is we're offering them the words of life. We're offering them Jesus Christ saying, hey, you can be saved from this sin. I know this feels hard. I know this feels like I'm telling you your whole lifestyle is sinful. That is true because God says that, not just because I say that, but the reality is Jesus is willing to save you if you turn to him. That's good news, and that's joy. So he says, I'm feeling the increasing pain of standing up for God in a world that doesn't like it. He says, I'm feeling that. And further, God makes things a little harder in chapter 16. He says at the beginning of chapter 16, Jeremiah, you shall not take a wife, nor shall you have sons or daughters in this place. For thus says the Lord concerning the sons and daughters who are born in this place, concerning the mothers who bore them, and concerning the mothers who bore them, and the fathers who fathered them in this land, they shall surely die of deadly diseases. So God tells Jeremiah straight up, you can't get married, you can't have kids. Just like, whoa. How often does that happen? Well, very, very rarely. But God tells Jeremiah, you cannot get married and you can't have kids. The question, though, is why? Because at this point, you might say, well, God's just being mean to Jeremiah. No. Do you see why? He's showing Jeremiah grace. He's showing Jeremiah kindness here. He's having mercy on Jeremiah here. Because if Jeremiah was to have a wife and kids, here's what God clearly says. If you do get married and you do that, the problem is they're all going to die of pestilence, of disease and sickness here in this land. So God's making a promise for all the Jerusalemites and all the Judeans. He says the newborn babies, they're all going to die. The kids, the toddlers, they're going to die. The moms who are giving birth, they're going to die. So Jeremiah, don't take a wife. Don't have kids. Which is a sad thing. And it's one of the reasons I think Jeremiah is such a lonely character in the Bible, because he doesn't have that many friends. He has a couple friends, but not many. And you're going to see how he's constantly persecuted here, and it's bad for him. He says later on in verse number 9, behold, I will silence this place. This is God speaking. God says, I will silence this place before your eyes and in your days, the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness and the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride. All the joy that people are having on the outside there, I'm going to silence that, which I want you to think that ought to be an encouragement for Jeremiah, because Jeremiah is the one who's sad. They're all happy. And God says, don't worry, Jeremiah. I'm going to settle their happiness. It's not right. They shouldn't be rejoicing in their sin while Jeremiah is suffering alone. He says, remember in verse 12, God's doing this, for behold, every one of you follows his stubborn, evil will, refusing to listen to me. Do you see the theology of Jeremiah here? It's that they're following their own hearts. They're doing what's wrong. God says later on, yeah, I am going to restore Israel. That's for sure. I'm going to do it, and it's going to be like a whole new type of salvation. I'm going to bring them out of the land of exile. That's going to be an even bigger deal than bringing them out of the land of Egypt. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be great, but no idol can make this happen. He says no idol can do what I'm about to do, and he's going to prove himself again and again. So let's look in the New Testament. We're looking at 1 Timothy chapter 5, more rules for church life. Specifically, we see different groups of people. So how should the pastor, Timothy, interact with different groups of people? He says, older men, make sure you don't rebuke them sharply. Make sure that when you're rebuking in sin, you have to do it in a gentle way. Same thing with the older women, right? Especially the older women. They're hard to deal with in the sense that you can't just tell them, don't do this, don't do that. Be careful, be gentle with them. And also the younger women, treat them as sisters with all purity. Don't make it hard for them to obey God's word. And the younger men too, he says, rebuke them like brothers, encourage them, tell them to do what's right. He says specifically about the widows, which is a big controversy apparently in this church. And I think that's why Paul is telling Timothy what to do with the widows. They, it says, are not supposed to be enrolled on the church log, so to speak, as widows. What that meant was some kind of financial assistance. He says, don't do that unless they're over 60 years old. You might say, why is that? Well, he says, if you're a younger widow, make sure that as a younger widow, so, imagine someone in their 30s or someone in their 40s whose husband dies, he says, encourage them, you know what, you should try to get remarried. Because if you don't, you're going to have problems. Obviously, raising your kid, that's going to be hard, which if you think about the widows who are over 60, you'd think most of their kids are grown at that point. If not all their kids are grown. You're not raising little kids in your home. He says if you're raising little kids in your home, it's a helpful piece of advice from the Apostle Paul. You probably should shoot to get remarried here. Then it says also to protect you from sin, to protect you from straying after Satan. And we don't know all of what that's talking about, but I guess we have a couple guesses. We don't want them to go into any type of sin, and they're more vulnerable to types of sin there. Further, I skipped a verse in verse 8 that is very important, that's kind of sandwiched between the widow passages, and it's important for all of us to remember. It says, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his own household, think your household, people who are living in your house. Back then, it was more than just your wife and your kids. It probably had to do with your parents and maybe some aunts and uncles maybe. But he says, if you don't provide for your household, you are worse than an unbeliever. It says you've denied the faith. Think about how strongly he puts that. If you're a Christian who is unwilling to take care of people in your family, you're worse than a non-Christian. That's a hard truth for us to grasp, which is why it's important for us to take care of our families. Then in verse 17 to the end, he talks about pastors. And he says, hey, elders, pastors, overseers, make sure that you treat them well. If they're ruling well, make sure they're considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. Then he says, make sure you're giving to them. Don't muzzle the ox. That was that Old Testament picture of putting a guard over an animal's mouth while they were treading out the grain. He says, let them eat. Let them benefit from the work that they're doing. He says, don't admit a charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. So he says, don't just believe any story that anyone has about something bad the pastor did. Make sure if any charge is brought against the pastor that it's done with 2 or 3 witnesses. But he says, Don't say that the pastors or the elders are above the law. That's not what he says. Verse 20, he says, for the ones that persist in sin, here's what you need to do. Special command for the pastor who won't give up his sin. He says, rebuke him in the presence of all. It has to be told to the church what he's done, which is different than the average churchgoer. It's a different standard that the pastor's held to here. It says, make sure you do this without partiality. Don't say, just because they're my friend, I don't want to do it. And I'm sure Timothy probably had that problem. He had friends who were with him who needed to be rebuked publicly. That was hard for him to do. And Paul says, I know that's going to be hard for you, Timothy, but you need to make sure that you do it. Then he says in verse 22, don't be hasty in the laying on of hands. Don't appoint new leaders too quickly. Make sure you're doing it slowly, thoughtfully, and prayerfully. And he says, don't get entangled in other people's sin, especially those sins where good works and bad works may be hidden for a while. One last thing in verse 23, he says, don't drink water only, use a little wine for the sake of your stomach, because he had some type of frequent problem with his body. Just an interesting note on that. Why is Timothy having to be told he has to drink wine? Absolutely, because he wasn't drinking any wine, because he was completely abstaining from alcohol, which I think is another one of the applications that we see of 1 Timothy 3, that the elder, the overseer, is not supposed to be a drunk, not supposed to be given much wine. Timothy took that and he wasn't even drinking anything. I think is a helpful pattern for leaders in God's church today as well. So thanks for reading. See you back tomorrow for another daily Bible reading snapshot.